everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Mariana Castillo Arce, and today we're going to be discussing the Rural Renewal stream in Jasper. The purpose is simply to better understand how this immigration process works and how it has been communicated locally and why transparency matters the most at this moment. So, today's presentation will be divided in three parts. First, we will explain what the Rural Renewal stream actually is. Then, we will discuss why many questions in Jasper are focused on the endorsement process. And finally, we will talk about a public petition asking for a public review of communication and transparency practices. But before continuing, I want to briefly introduce myself and explain why I become interested in this issue. Now, I am a Mexican student at the University of Alberta, majoring in law, crime, and justice since 2023. My connection to Jasper did not start with academics. I worked in Jasper during the summer of 2024, during the wildfire, and again in 2025, during the recovery period. After experiencing workplace abuse in 2025, I decided to merge my personal experience with my professional preparation and focus on labor issues, workplace harms, and workers' rights. Through this work, I have received research recognition, including awards for international researcher and knowledge mobilization. I do not say this to brag, I say it because I want to be clear about what I can offer today and also about my limits. Therefore, I want to clarify that I am not a lawyer, and also I am not an immigration advisor. Thus, I cannot give legal or immigration advice. I am here as a student, a researcher, and someone who cares about this community that I once belonged to. And I organize this event not because I have all the answers, but because just like you, I also have questions. Which is why I decided to create this independent research project and just like you, try to understand what the rural renewal stream is and how does it work. So, the Rural Renewal Stream, or RRS, is part of Alberta's immigration system. Its purpose is to help rural communities attract and keep newcomers when they need workers for local economic development. In general, as we can see in the slide, I divided the process into four important parts. First is the process of becoming a designated community, which, according to the RRS website, a rural community has to first apply to be part of this stream or program. And Jasper went through this process and became an official designated community on September 13, 2022. Since then, as the second part shows, the designated community is in charge of locally endorsing candidates. In Jasper, this process is controlled by an Economic Development Organization, or EDO, locally named the Jasper Employment and Education Center, or JEC. In this case, after the JEC decides who gets the endorsement, the process moves to the Alberta Advantage Immigration Program, or AIIP. At that point, you're no longer looking for an endorsement, you're looking for an invitation from the provincial government. In this stage, the designated community no longer decides who receives an invitation, as the process belongs to another government level and agency. Lastly, assuming you get invited, you would apply through the RRCC and wait to get nominated for your permanent resident. So, the RRS is a complicated process that involves different levels of government, and the criteria might change at different stages as you go. The endorsement process only gives you extra points for you to be part of the stages 3 and 4, as we can see in the slides. But in this sense, endorsement is a stage 2, invitation stage 3, and nomination stage 4. And what I want you to keep in mind today is precisely these three words are not the same thing. They are different steps controlled by different parts of the system. And today we are looking at the only process the JEC controls, which means who gets endorsed. Therefore, if you're waiting for an invitation or nomination, that is outside Jasper's control. And if you're waiting for an endorsement, then this is exactly what we're talking about today, which is why it has a red square around it. However, if you're unsure about your stage, what you need, or what you can do next, I strongly encourage you to speak with a licensed immigration advisor. And if you need help to find one, please let me know and maybe we can find someone that meets your language and budget requirements together. Now, coming back to our topic, because designated communities have a say in the decision process, according to the Alberta Association of Immigrant Service Agencies, or ASA, designated communities are expected to do much more than simply hand out endorsement letters. For example, they have to develop strategies to ensure the recruitment and settlement of the workers, or the participation on employers that meet the preliminary requirements, such as not having employment or health complaints and offering a full time, non seasonal job. Now, after attracting potential employers that meet preliminary requirements, these employers can request to the community an endorsement on behalf of the candidate or the worker. Now, this is the part that most of you are familiar with because your employer sent something to the JEC and then you or your employer were told that you were or were not selected. But assuming you were selected, that means that the JEC would issue the endorsement letter, which would give you extra points, making you a stronger candidate when you enter to stages 3 and 4. And this is where local criteria, or what Jasper is looking for, comes into place. The designated community, or in this case the JEC, can add criteria such as occupations or priority groups with intention to improve local economy. So, in other words, the designated community, according to the ASA, is expected to select candidates that, yes, should have a stronger possibility to enter stages 3 and 4, but also a candidate that would strengthen the economy of the town if they stay. In this sense, this is what we would call the government versus the local criteria. On this note, today we'll focus on what is the local criteria and how it has impacted the experiences of the applicants, which it's important to highlight that is not explicitly stated in the JET website. Yet, through online records of previous years, we can see that after the RRS started in Jasper, employers were constantly encouraged to participate, and the town would provide as many endorsement letters as possible, showcasing a possible lack of local criteria that systematically allow operations without further public conflict. But of course, in 2024, the wildfire disrupted everything, and the JEC could no longer continue giving as many endorsement letters as they wanted. And like many organizations and businesses in town, the JEC had to adapt during the evacuation and recovery period. And at the end of the day, they closed the RRS and focused on motivating people to come back to the town. However, the concerns that we're discussing today begin mainly after the JEC stabilized the RRS, which means after more than a year or after the wildfire around September 2025. According to workers' testimonies, around this date, the JEC started to hold meetings with employers to explain how businesses could participate and how they could support candidates that are already in the town for endorsement. After that, workers and employers began preparing documents, checking eligibility, and trying to apply until the deadline, January 5th of 2026, the date where everything started to get confusing. Because do you remember that I mentioned that before the JEC would give as many endorsement letters as they wanted? Well, this rule changed at the beginning of 2026, more specifically January 1st, when the AIIP declared that from now on, towns would have a limited amount of endorsements they could issue, and these would vary in population and economic needs. But official numbers are not mentioned for any town. In this sense, workers and employers were told that Jasper only had 9 spaces instead of the larger number many believe will be available. In the image of the left, that I know that is very small, we see what looks the official document that confirms this number, issued by the JEC and sent by email to employers. In this document, the JEC explained that due to limited number of endorsements, they decided to give priority to 34 previous endorsed candidates from the previous years and renew their endorsed letter. Thus, for the first time, we see somewhat local criteria that answers why maybe new applicants of 2025 didn't get an endorsement. However, this document still does not answer how were these 9 candidates selected and what about the rest of the candidates? Why were not selected? Moreover, this criteria system opens broader questions about the advantages of the program because it allows to question if when a decision is based on antiquity, then how does the local economic benefit is prioritized? Besides, as we can see in the far right, this document was provided to me by the JEC, but it doesn't have a date, so I don't know whether this explanation was communicated clearly at the right time, and especially since none of the workers I spoke with were aware of this document. On the other hand, if we continue with our timeline, we can see that by February and throughout March, which is when I entered the town, the JEC had in their website a short first message to explain the number 9. And it says, and I quote, Alberta Immigration has conducted the draw for Jasper community for this year, and we are not expecting more invitations until 2027. Invitations. Do you remember that word? Exactly. Stage 3, controlled by the government of Alberta. And this matters because from my conversation with workers, some called endorsements invitations and others called invitations endorsements. So they had an incorrect understanding of the process. And when asking them how they learned this information, they mentioned either private or semi private meetings with the JEC personnel, as well as checking their website. Now, in this point, workers started to have conversations with other workers that also had private or semi private meetings with the JEC, which led them to notice the differences in the explanations. And inevitably, this led to reject workers doing outside research and looking for more information, such as reaching out the municipality, interviewing each other, and starting to compare with other towns, showing that when immigrants compare their experiences, timelines, immigration profiles, and what they had been told, they can create their own investigative study to understand whether the process had been fair. For example, after many workers did not receive endorsement letters, they began comparing Jasper's website with other designated communities to understand what happened. And through that comparison, they started noticing differences in designated communities. For instance, in Hinton, the number of endorsement spaces is publicly visible, 31 allocations. But in Jasper, while the number that we all know is 9, this is not visible nowhere in the website. Besides, Hinton mentioned that there is no guarantee to get the endorsement as the priority of the town is to ensure that, and I quote, Hinton's labor force grows steadily, stably, and sustainably, something that again the Jasper website does not have. On the other hand, in Grand Prairie, even if they do not publish exact numbers, they clearly explain that some information will not be disclosed before the application process. In other words, they have clear disclaimers around their local eligibility criteria. As then mentioned, the applicants, and I quote, acknowledge and agree that their application may not be processed in the order received or at all. Further, the decision to assess, process any particular application and the outcome of any such assessment or processing is at the City of Grand Prairie's Rural Renewal Stream Immigration Program sole discretion. And I close quote. Therefore, the applicant knows that no matter the outcome, their possibilities to dispute it are minimal. And while we can spend a good time asking how good or not this is, what I want you to notice is that workers started to identify this difference too in Jasper by noticing that the JEC does not have a disclaimer like Grand Prairie, which gave them the idea to dispute the result. On the other hand, and more generally, they noticed differences in cost of processes for employers and the way they share information, showcasing the level of agency each town has to share the program. However, still none of the findings made by the immigrants could fully explain how did the JEC decide who got the endorsements, which eventually lead to more private meetings with the personnel. Now, this is precisely where the public question begins, because immigrants already had the questions about the program and they did their own research and they did reach again the JEC that led to more private meetings. And the only thing that people were interested to know is in how the 2026 process was managed. But as they reported more meetings with the JEC personnel, they had less answers and they had more questions. For instance, in a semi private meeting where people with endorsed letters were invited, it was explained that the JEC got 9 spaces and the government chose from a pool of 35 ish candidates from previous years, which matches the description of the document we saw before, which discusses endorsed letters. We know there were 9 spaces and there was a previous pool of 34. However, this number 9 is for endorsed letters, not for invitations. And as explained by the document that the JEC provided, we know that these 9 spaces are to reduce the previous poll of 34, which means that from now on, the government of Alberta would have a pool of 9 non 35 ish. Moreover, in terms of the targeted audience, if the people invited were those with endorsed letters, then they were not interested in the number of endorsement allocations that changed in 2026 event, but in the selection process of stage 3, where the AIP invites workers. Therefore, this is an example of how public information can get confusing from the delivery of the JEC and why allocation clarity is necessary, mostly because it has been deficient. And besides, some workers also say that after asking for help from the temporary foreign worker program coordinator, they were discouraged from staying in Jasper and told that their best immigration strategy was to leave their jobs and the town they helped rebuild. While their coordinator improved the while the coordinator improved their immigration status in the process. This, of course, has led for the rejected candidates to interpret the deficiency as part of a strategy to not distribute the endorsements fairly but by preference, showing how the lack of clarity creates distrust, and when this is managed poorly, serious speculations emerge. And this is where my research comes in, because due to my previous work looking at the labor environment in Jasper, a worker contacted me to tell me their experience and then recruit other people to share their experiences with me as well. They also passed me all the information they have found from this small investigative study they did first. And now, so far, complementing their findings with my findings, my research is partially complete, and today I'm giving you the results of that. To start, as we have seen, the AIP created the Rural Renewal stream in 2021 so that designated communities could identify the workers they needed the most, and they were allowed to give as many endorsement letters as they wanted. And just in 2026, the province put a limit on this number effective on January 1st of that year. And these letters would only have 1 year validity, would which would justify the prioritization of the pool of 34 previous candidates. But overall, this means that yes, the province controls the number of endorsed letters from now on. But there is no official document that shows the amount any community gets, nor an explanation about the criteria other than the ones provided by the IIP, leaving the local criteria set by the JEC committee still very unclear. And I tried to tackle this limitation by looking for academics that had experience researching the program and maybe they could explain to me what are these local criterias. And what I found was that their answers show that there is local criteria that would be helpful to the designated community to improve their economy. And especially, these local criteria plays an important role when the demand is higher than the availability. However, these are not public because they don't have to. The program does not force designated communities to disclose the information regarding the endorsement letters, which again creates a lack of official evidence whenever there is these type of questions and keeps the program running inefficiently in a cycle. So, in other words, there are other researchers like me that have been seeing that public records of local criteria are not mandatory, and communities might decide to have them or not, especially because the program is very demanding and unclear. But at the same time, these processes might lead to mismanagement and creates a barrier to the rest of the community to see the areas of improvement of the program because it centralizes the power in just one community with full unclear discretion. Therefore, across Alberta, the Rural Renewal stream has blank spaces that allow communities to apply their own rules in different ways without any responsibility to disclose information, even though this is a program difficult to manage. And in Jasper, this raises important questions, especially when the program has a total personnel of two, maybe three workers, and some with a limited experience in the program and about immigration. On this note, my research has shown the mismanagement of the program is possible, especially when communities rely on provincial guidelines and they do not develop their economic plan. Jasper may or may not have this plan, but so far this is not clear. and has not been explained to the workers even after requesting meetings for close analysis and personalized explanation. And if the JEC personnel claims that it has, well, workers have definitely not understood it as such. So, right now, there is a problem between what workers report, how the program is supposed to operate, and how it did. And this problem is about transparency with the criteria to the rejected workers in the process of January 2026. From my analysis, the lack of uniform public information has created confusion for foreign workers affected by the 9 allocation decision, and from it, they describe the support they received as unclear, incomplete, or poorly communicated. However, the JEC is a popularly known to have somewhat immigration knowledge in the town, and immigrants often feel they don't have any source to verify the information, not even the municipality. And this is evident with the new comment program present in their website and the stories of the previous executive director, as reported by the CBC, who from offices in Edmonton and Calgary look for ways to replace documents and apply for new work permits to help immigrants to return to the town after the wildfire. However, a different story emerges when immigrants started to inquire about permanent resident processes instead of remaining just as workers. For instance, the Rural Renewal Stream program, a service that was not offered during the evacuation and recovery process, despite being a strong option to guarantee immigrants to return to the town and their jobs. But that's a different topic. What I want us to focus is that, yes, the JEC is extremely vital to immigrant workers, and they have proved it even after disaster. Yet, regarding the Rural Renewal program, the gaps of information they have created for whatever reason is resulting in distrust and speculations of intentional wrongdoing. And this is not with intention to accuse anyone, it's just to show the consequences after immigrants constantly receive vague explanations that led them to believe that the government rejected their endorsement and not the community, in private meetings with unprepared personnel that transform guidance into immigration advice, such as recommending people to change locations based on their immigration profile. Therefore, as we can see in the image below, after my conversations with the JEC have evolved, also their website, which recently added a measure to deal with these complaints by putting, and I quote, have questions about the rural renewal stream? As the community operators of Jasper's Rural Renewal program, please reach out for clear and current information on how the program works in the community. However, that is the problem. The community operators no longer hold the trust of the people. And after a short conversation with workers, it was possible to understand why. For instance, workers didn't know that the JEC is not an immigration center until I told them that, nor part of the municipal government. Instead, they interpreted the JEC as a local immigration support center that had capable personnel to maximize their chances to get a permanent residence by analyzing their immigration profile. But that's not the case. The JEC is a non-profit organization authorized to give settlement guidance, but this is one of their many functions, and the lack of preparation and the immigration topics is visible for those who attended these meetings. For instance, the constant confusion of the term invitations and endorsement, or the lack of professionalism from personnel that are simply not authorized to give immigration advice and they do not disclaim that to the workers in their private meetings. On this note, sadly, trust is broken, and the lack of clear information has just led to more speculations that polarize the foreign population. And this is why verbal explanations are no longer enough, especially those that are private or semi private. For affected workers, transparency has come to a point where only with official documents immigrants could trust again in the JEC. At the same time, while documents are important, let's remember the rural renewal stream is not only paperwork. It affects real decisions of residents, whether workers stay, whether businesses can plan, and whether people trust the process. And for affected temporary residents, transparency would help them understand what happened and why. For businesses, it will give them clearer rules before they make any promises to employees. And for the rural renewal managers and council, it helps answer the important questions of what criteria were used and allows to identify areas of improvement. And for the community, it can rebuild trust by showing that the process is open, fair, and based on official information. That is why promoting transparency through official documents is the best way forward. It avoids rumors, personal blame, and confusion. Instead of asking people to guess, official documents allow everyone to see the same information at the same time. In this case, when information is public, workers, businesses, and the town can make better decisions together. Therefore, what we need to understand is that at this point, the question is no longer whether people are confused or not. The question is what information could be disclosed to help rebuild the trust between the JEC and the foreign workers affected by the 2026 endorsement allocation process in a fair and professional way while prioritizing the private information of individuals. For that, I propose that accessing JEC documentation will help to better understand how the process worked and how decisions were communicated. For example, official correspondence with the province could help clarify how many spaces Jasper received, whether additional invitations were possible, and what instructions communities were given by Alberta. Program records could also help the public understand the scale of the situation, how many people apply, how many people were approved or denied of an endorsement, how many endorsement letters were issued, and when. Another important area is the decision making process itself. If there were criteria used to prioritize some candidates over others, people naturally will want to know what those criteria were and whether they were applied consistently. On this note, communication records also matter because many workers say they receive different explanations at different moments. Looking at public statements, emails, or presentation materials could help identify where misunderstandings started to happen and how communication could improve in the future. Finally, because the rural renewal stream affects town's labor market and immigration growth, this is why a neutral review matters. Because a neutral body can look documents professionally, protect private information, and focus on facts instead of rumors. Workers, businesses, and organizations all deserve a process where the answers come from evidence, not assumptions. Therefore, when people only receive information privately at different times and with different information, confusion grows very quickly. Some workers are told one thing, employers hear another version, and the broader community is left trying to understand what is actually true. And that is why a public review matters. It creates one shared source of information. Everyone, workers, employers, organizations, and the municipality all together hearing the same explanations at the same time and looking at the evidence together. Besides, this is also important for businesses as many employers want to support their workers honestly. But if the process is unclear, businesses can end up making promises they cannot guarantee. And a clearer and more transparent process protects employers too. At the same time, a review allows the community to identify what parts of the system are not working properly. Maybe the issue is communication. Maybe it is the structure of the program itself. Maybe communities were given responsibilities without enough support or guidance. But we cannot improve processes if nobody is allowed to openly examine it. And finally, this matters because the rural renewal stream is not just an immigration issue. It affects Jasper's economy, workforce, reputation, and community trust. The municipality is deeply connected to those outcomes, so it makes sense for the town to be part of the conversation as well. Therefore, a transparent review is one of the few ways to move the conversation forward in a fair and constructive way. On this note, we are not asking the municipality to decide immigration cases and we're not asking for a special treatment for specific workers. What we're asking for is a public review of transparency and communication practices surrounding the rural renewal stream in Jasper, specifically in January 2026, and the past information that led to those decisions. Why? Because behind every missing explanation, there is a worker who planned a future here. There is a business that needs staff. There is a family waiting for certainty. There is a town that depends on immigrant workers. but has not fully listened to them. And having a staff report, local criteria documents, and any other available public information will help Jasper through a path of accountability, transparency, and fairness. And that is why signatures matter. One signature can be ignored, 10 signatures can be questioned, but when many people sign in, it becomes harder to say this is not a real problem. If you sign this petition, you're saying that this community deserves the truth, that workers deserve respect, and Jasper should not be built on confusion. Therefore, if you sign this, it will not guarantee an endorsement letter or an invitation, and it will not immediately change anyone's immigration status, but it can help open the door to a fairer environment for the future foreign workers. And a public review can force the questions that people have been asking privately for months to finally be answered publicly. So today, I am asking you to sign this petition to have a public review, not only for yourself, but for the workers who are afraid to speak, for the people who already left, and for the future immigrants who might come to Jasper believing in the same promise. So, thank you so much for listening today. And if you agree that more transparency and public clarification will help workers, employers, and the community, I invite you to read and consider signing the petition. Thank you.